Field Marshal Prince Albert. It's not a contradiction in terms, because when Victoria decided to marry Albert, and in fact as queen she had to propose to him, he couldn't do that himself. She was 20 and he was 6 months younger. Still 20, but 6 months younger. And he had to have a uniform in which to be married, an English uniform. After all, he came from a tiny principality in Germany, Coburg. Coburg had then, I guess, what you would call half the population of present-day Reykjavik in Iceland. And remember, Victoria was the queen of the largest empire in the world. And so she proposed. But she had to get him an English uniform, and he left in England when he accepted the proposal, jumped at the idea, in fact. He needed a job. He left his court uniform from the Principality of Coburg in London so that the Queen's tailor could fashion him a new uniform. And the tailor made him the uniform of a field marshal, because after all, he was being married to the Queen. And so he became Field Marshal Prince Albert at age 20. And so he had a lot to live up to. And that's basically what I want to talk about this evening. Albert would be caricatured by the press as soon as they discovered this field marshal business. And I'll show you an example of it here because I think it's useful to see. You can come up afterwards and look at it. Here is Prince Albert on a rocking horse in his field marshal's uniform. It will give you an idea of how the British public felt about making a 20-year-old with no military experience a field marshal. It would only be a costume in which to be wed. He had no duties. In fact, his only duty was to sire the succession. And he did a very good job of that over the years. There were 9 children, and there were quite enough to make sure that there would be a succession. But there were jokes constantly about what his other duties were other than between the sheets. And there was a little verse that was published in one of the papers that talked about how the Queen kept high festival in Windsor's lordly hall, and round her sat the gartered knights and ermined nobles all. There drank the valiant Wellington, the Duke of Wellington, and there fed the wary Peel. Peel was the prime minister. And at the bottom of the board, Prince Albert carved the veal. Is again an idea of his duties. But it was assumed then by politicians that the Queen, as one of them said, is only really a phantom. She's put there not to act, but to fill space, to prevent anyone else from being there. And perhaps that's more true today than it was in Victoria's day. But Albert became the kind of activist to make sure that the monarchy filled up more than space. The Duke of Wellington was not invited to the wedding reception because Albert and Victoria felt so angry at him because he cut the stipend of Albert below what previous princes had received, and they did not invite him. Nevertheless, he became very friendly with the new royal family, the young royals, and he discovered that Albert was a paragon of organization. After all, he was a German. He was very well disciplined. He knew what to do, and it was very orderly. Albert took everything under study and always emerged with suggestions. And this didn't happen much under Wellington's regime. And so he went to Albert regularly and asked him for ideas, because Albert came from a place where there was a disciplined army, the various principalities of Germany, where they still had a draft, where people were expected regularly to fulfill their military obligations. And so they were married only a few years. It was 1844, I think, 4 years after they were married, when Albert emerged with his first suggestions for Wellington that he felt were worthwhile. For one thing, he said they ought to stop dueling in the military, that all the dueling did was cause casualties that they couldn't afford because they didn't have very many officers who were activist enough to really fulfill the job. Wellington agreed, and dueling was stopped. And by the way, you've seen up front the costume of Albert in his field marshal's uniform, complete with medals. The medals business is a very curious matter. All royalty at this time walked around with medals, that is male royalty, walked around with medals, because anytime they visited another sovereign, whether it was a ruling prince or a duke or a king, whatever it was, they were given a medal, because you had to give the person a gift of some sort. So you gave them a medal, the Grand Star of this and the Diamond Cross of that, and so on. And Albert soon had a load of medals for doing nothing, which is a good deal. Like I remember in the Army, seeing people wearing medals of having, well, the Good Conduct Medal, and the medal for having served in the American Theater of Operations, which meant they never left the States, and so on. And so and the Victory Medal, of course, even though you may have had nothing much to do with the victory. There you had a whole row of ribbons, and you hadn't done anything. So Albert had a bunch of medals very early on. One thing he did early on, too, was to design a new hat for the military. I don't know why he thought it was necessary, but the military hats in Central Europe were very different than those worn in England. And he soon decided that they needed one, and he designed a hat that was conical but flat on top and had a brim, and Punch, the comic magazine, described it as a decided cross between a muff, a coal scuttle, and a slop pail. The Hungarian army used it. It was called a shako. And here you see Albert designing it. This is Albert's studio. He's designing a shako. His noble beginning, though, was derided in the press, and they decided that the best thing he could do if he wanted economies in the service and more efficiency was to resign his commission. And so here was another cartoon showing him resigning his commission, which, of course, he had never done. That would have saved a lot of money. One of Albert's achievements early on was to have designed the first World's Fair, the Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851, which he began working on quite early along in the marriage. It was not only the first World's Fair, it was probably the greatest World's Fair, a very successful one, and for the first time, science and technology, which Albert was very interested in, were brought to public notice in a grand style. But again, the press had to make fun of everything he did, especially in his army capacity. And there was a competition for an exhibition building in Hyde Park, for the one that won was eventually called the Crystal Palace. It was the first glass building that was built in a prefabricated fashion. It was a very interesting building. But here is the building they showed in the press. Notice it's Albert's hat. He could not get away from his hat. And they continued to make fun of Albert's hat. Yet it was adopted, and it was worn until 1855, despite the fact that caricaturists loved it. When he was 31, in 1850, a possible appointment in the military both teased and anguished Albert. The aged Duke of Wellington, the hero of Waterloo, understood that he could no longer function as commander-in-chief. He was just too old. He just didn't have it anymore. He had known Albert now for 10 years. He thought that Albert, who had been derided as a field marshal, was the most efficient man in the military. He appreciated his ability, his brains, and he suggested on a visit to Windsor that Albert succeed the hero of Waterloo. This was a real temptation for Albert. How could you imagine having a job that was more dignified and more significant in the military than succeeding Wellington? The temptation was worth some sleepless nights as he thought about it. Yet he knew the impossibility of it all. Candidly, at Wellington's annual Waterloo dinner, held in mid-June on the anniversary of the Waterloo Battle, Albert had responded to a toast proposed by the Duke that he appreciated the honor of being able to participate in an occasion to which he said, "No merit of my own could entitle me." And that was a clue as to what his decision was going to be. He knew that that's how the press would treat it. They would say, what did he do other than marry Victoria and beget all those children that we have to pay for? Because after all, every child needed an allowance that Parliament had to vote. He did not see any way to do it. So he thought this would compromise his already compromised position, and he wrote to the Duke that he thought that he had to be guided by whether, as he put it, it would interfere with or assist my position of consort to the sovereign and the performance of the duties which this position imposes on me. He said he recognized that this position would make him peculiar and delicate. If he were successful in the duty, it would strengthen the Queen and strengthen the monarchy. But if he were unsuccessful at it, or if the press took it with hostility, it would cause a great deal of damage to the crown. He decided that his position as the husband of the Queen requires that the husband should entirely sink his own individual existence into that of his wife, that he should not aim at any power for himself or by himself, but make his position entirely part of hers, to fill up every gap which as a woman she would naturally leave in the exercise of her regal function. And he would do that very soon. And so he listed a litany of functions that he already performed for the Queen. And Wellington's proposal, he said, was a tempting idea which he must discard. Unfortunately, he did discard it, and it caused trouble in the military because the only people left were incompetents. But from then on, Albert continued the practice of writing memoranda in the Queen's name for her to sign. She hardly ever wrote anything or had any idea that was her own. They were Albert's. And she was commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy, which is how Albert got to be a field marshal. Nevertheless, Albert, in all but name, took over those duties. She signed the papers. Very often, she took his memo and rewrote it in her own hand, so it looked as if she wrote it herself. But pretty soon, everybody understood. The old Duke died in 1852. He had worked until close to the end, reporting regularly, by the way, to Albert, whom he regarded as his moral, if not his actual successor. And the Prince took the old soldier's pride in his troops to be an index to their readiness for modern war. It stated, the Duke deplored to Albert, that the British infantry cannot march, that the cavalry cannot ride, that the officers are ignorant, that the soldiers don't know the use of and cannot use their arms. He didn't want Albert to believe that, he said. And the Prince's veneration of Wellington ensured that the armed services be set by military parsimony and the purchase of commissions. The only way you got a commission in the Army or the Navy was to buy it. And if you came from a wealthy aristocratic family and you had a second or third son who wasn't going to inherit anything, you wanted something for him to do. And so you either bought him a ministry in the Church of England or you bought him a commission. And the commissions continued to be purchased for decades thereafter because the aristocracy insisted on it. Into the unstable 1850s, the British Army existed on the purchase of commissions, able to defeat bands of alleged savages in petty colonial skirmishes, but they could hardly do more than that. They couldn't defend England if they had to. Although Albert wasn't blind to shortcomings in the services, Wellington had been untouchable and unapproachable. He was godlike as far as the English were concerned. Now, the day after the Prince learned of the death of the Duke, he penned a memorandum to himself based on his immediate exchanges with the Prime Minister and observed that the loss of Wellington had been a loss of authority, but not a loss in efficiency. And I think that was possibly indelicate, but the Duke was dead, and it was all right. Albert had a list now of titles and duties that he thought had to be handled, and a list of things that he thought the Army and Navy ought to be doing. So he was prepared for Wellington's death, but he wasn't prepared to take on the job himself. He had to find people within the existing services who could take on those jobs. He said that I would carry no weight with the public, and I have not been able to conceal from myself that the many attacks on the Army which have been sleeping on account of the Duke's presence will now be forthcoming. And this would happen. At 64, a desk officer who had been military secretary of the headquarters unit, the Horse Guards, as it was called, for 25 years, and close to Wellington for 40, was appointed second in command. This was Lord Somerset, who had lost his right arm at Waterloo, was totally incompetent, but was considered a hero. He became Lord Raglan. He was given a new title, Lord Raglan, and he then, as I said, became second in command. Albert knew he could not take that job. The secretary to the Privy Council, a man named Greville, privately carped that the prince had shown little judgment in his military appointments and had made himself effectively the heir, which was probably true. He said that was ridiculous as well as odious, but he had no idea that Albert had actually refused it. All he knew is who was appointed second in command, so he assumed that the first person would still be Albert. He hadn't known that Somerset, who was Greville's own favorite, had nearly, but for Albert's intervention, declined his own promotion. What had happened is that Somerset said, I can't become Lord Raglan. If I'm to go up in title, it's going to mean that I have to perform social functions and buy uniforms and do various other things that I can't afford. A title had to be afforded socially. And so Albert arranged quietly that money from the royal purse would go to the new Lord Raglan, so he could afford to be Lord Raglan and take the job. And Somerset never knew it, never knew where it came from. Recognizing that he was the only one with sufficient clout, with Wellington gone, to speak up for the military, in a major speech a few months after Wellington died, Albert urged, in effect, upon a stingy parliament, what he called an end to the penury that hobbled the armed services. He was at a dinner, a major dinner, where there were speeches and toasts, and he proposed a toast to the Army and Navy, and said in his toast that he hoped Britain, and I'm quoting him, was not so enervated by the enjoyment of riches and luxury, or so sunk into the decrepitude of age, from a miserable eagerness to cling to our mere wealth and comfort, we should be deaf to the calls of honor and duty. The coded message was very easy to interpret. The riches and the luxury had been secured at somebody else's cost. India was a collection of fiefdoms that benefited few Indians. The opium wars that opened China to commerce had an incalculable moral cost. The colonization of more and more of Africa had made the continent more and more accessible to missionaries, but also to slavers. Few Africans were the better for it. The armed services that had planted the Union Jack nationwide, or worldwide rather, were in no condition to defend Britain itself. You can imagine the kind of applause that Albert got at that dinner. It was a pretty quiet response. It was not even polite. Ornaments of the class whose interests they thought he represented felt badly served by such badgering to spend their unearned money. This was at a time in the early 1850s when there was suddenly a new glory in Europe, the Second Empire. Louis Napoleon, the nephew of the first Napoleon, had seized power in France and made himself Napoleon III. He skipped the second, by the way, because Napoleon had had a son who died, who would have been Napoleon II, you see, if he had lived. So discreetly, he became Napoleon III, crowning himself. Actually, he got the Pope to do it, but the Pope wasn't too eager to do it. At that time, things were getting more and more dicey in Europe, especially with Russia. Russia was eager to expand further and further into Europe. Louis Napoleon didn't want that to happen because he wanted to be the major power on the continent of Europe. And this looked like war coming. Albert said, we have to put more money into the military. Disraeli was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the equivalent of our Treasury Secretary. And he asked Disraeli to add £230,000 to the military budget to buy new equipment and to afford new soldiers. £230,000 was $1 million in the money of those days, and that was a great deal of money when you figure that it was worth 20 or more times what it is worth now. "We're cleaning our rusty cannons and building fortifications," Albert wrote to his brother Ernest on the 2nd of November of 1852. "We have 80,000 men ready and we're improving our weapons." And he asked his brother to import for England a new Prussian gun that the English might copy. "We're quite unprepared," he emphasized to the new commander-in-chief, who was Lord Harding, underlining his words. He compared the slow Wellington-era muzzle-loading guns to the breech-loading rapid-fire gun when it arrived from Germany. Harding worried Albert about the expense. This was the commander-in-chief now. "We can't afford it," he said, "and we have all those weapons from 1815 still to use." And that was the way they were going to operate. It would take an invasion scare to get them to do something to modernize the military. Prince Albert was one of the few possessors of influence to keep pressing for more modernization. In later years, he would badger the cabinet to equip the army, again, with these breech-loading arms, and the generals still insisted on the muzzle loaders. And what happened is that Wellington's army used Wellington's old guns, and the French, under Napoleon III, bought the new weapons. A later general, Sir Garnet Wolseley, who was one of the famous British generals of the second half of the century, commented later to Disraeli, "Albert was our only soldier. He was the only one interested in the military and interested in army reform." Reforms in the military hadn't gone very far when the Crimean War with Russia began early in 1854. Albert was in such bad odor at that time with the public. They thought that he was, of all things, a sympathizer with Russia, which was exactly the opposite of anything that was true. They thought this because the Prussian nobility was allied by marriage to the Tsar's family, and they just assumed that Germans and Russians were going to get together out of familial loyalty. That was not true of Albert, but a rumor spread that Albert had been arrested for treason and put in the Tower of London. And people believed it. They really believed that Albert was a traitor, and crowds gathered outside the Tower of London to see if Albert was peering through the bars. And another rumor had Victoria arrested because she refused to do anything unless he were let loose, and decided to go with him. None of this was true. It ended quickly, though, because war with Russia began in 1854. The issues were the survival of Turkey as a buffer to Russia and Russian expansionist designs in Europe. The excuses for war, with France joining England, were of course very different. You always find some petty excuse. As with most wars, popular expectation was for a short and victorious affair. It was easy to ignore the reality that Britain had fought no war for 40 years and wasn't ready to fight one now. Albert inspected his battalion of guards. In addition to being field marshal, he was also colonel of a guards battalion. Being colonel of a guards battalion was about as high as you could go in the social elite through the military. But of course, when his guards unit was activated for duty, he could not go with them. Somebody else had to, because he had to stay in England. Nicholas I of Russia did go to war with France and with England. Lord Harding was in charge of the army. He was 69. His deputy, the one-armed Lord Raglan, had not performed ever in military service since he had been wounded in the Napoleonic Wars. Most senior generals and admirals were veterans of those wars of 1810 to 1815 against the first Napoleon. They were physically unfit for the rigors of combat service. And recognizing that, the London Times quoted the remark of Prime Minister Pitt, who was then later Lord Chatham, about the senior officers ordered off to put down the American Revolution a couple of generations earlier. He said then, "I don't know what effect these names have on the enemy, but I confess they make me tremble." And Albert said he felt the same way about the men in the Crimea. A case in point was the admiral of the battle fleet that was sent into the Baltic to fight the Russians there. The leader of it, Sir Charles Napier, was nearly 70, had captained the ship Thames in battle against the French in the Mediterranean in 1811. This was now 1855, landing near Baltimore against the United States later and burning the White House. So he had an interesting experience earlier, but he was unfit for combat then. But few in Britain worried, although again the newspapers used the opportunity for cartoon jokes, and one of them was called Grand Military Spectacle, and you see the heroes of the Crimea inspecting the field marshals. And the heroes are here, and the very aged, doddering field marshals are there, and Albert is the only young one standing up straight. In fact, he's the only one able to stand up straight in the senior military. This is the only non-doddering field marshal, and the result was that he had to really run the Crimean War for the British. He had to do more than that because Napoleon insisted that he had to overrule the generals on his side and run the war himself. Who could talk to an emperor? The generals and the admirals on the British side had no way they could deal with Napoleon III. There had to be somebody of equal weight. And so Albert was deputed, and Albert spent a lot of time during that war dealing with Napoleon and dealing with strategy with Napoleon. And perhaps the most strategic triumph that he made during that entire period was to prevent Napoleon from going to the Crimea to lead the French army, because that would have been a total disaster. If he had done that, Albert warned him, he didn't want to do it on military terms. He didn't want to say, you're as incompetent as anybody, you can't go. He said, they need you in France. Things would be very bad in France if you should be wounded or killed. You must stay in France and run the war from France. And so he stayed in France, and that made everybody very happy. Things were bad, though, for many months in the Crimea because of incompetence. The troops were helpless in the local squalor and heat and lack of supplies and inadequate munitions and illness. And Albert had to continue to badger them. That's the word I've used a number of times, but that was what he had to do, to badger the military into doing something sensible for once. The mismanagement extended to sanitation, supplies, just about everything. This is the period, you may remember, when Florence Nightingale went to war and helped clean up what they called then in the United States the Sanitary Commission, which meant really the medical services. Albert crossed the Channel to observe with the Emperor the maneuvers of the French troops, 70,000 troops, not as the Queen's husband, but as the senior field marshal in Britain at age 35. Obviously, he had the longest service as a field marshal. He had been a field marshal since he was 20. And with an entourage of ministers and military men, he did achieve a wary rapport with Napoleon that did help them finally get to be unified and to win the war, though I think they won the war largely, as in many other wars, because the other side was more incompetent. It's always the least incompetent side that wins wars. At one point, Count Walewski, who was the foreign minister for Napoleon III, told the Queen about Albert, claiming that this was what he'd been told by Napoleon, that Napoleon had never met a person possessing such various and profound knowledge, or who communicated it with the same frankness. He had never learned so much in a short time, and he was grateful. What he meant, and this was very diplomatic, is that Albert did not suffer fools gladly, and he apparently was quite blunt with Napoleon about many things. He needed these person-to-person meetings. One way he finally succeeded in getting Napoleon not to go to the Crimea was to bring him to England and host him at Windsor and lionize him, and at that point he was then susceptible to entreaties. And to Prince William of Russia, Albert joked, "I shall have to have precautions taken in the crypt of St. George's Chapel to see to it that George III does not turn in his grave," because after all, a Napoleon had come to England. I must mention something about what happened to Albert's Guards unit. He was, after all, as I said, colonel in the Guards. The man who replaced him was Colonel Francis Grosvenor Hood, and Albert wrote to him, the 1st Grenadier Guards commander, "Of my admiration of the manner in which the battalion of my regiment under your command bore itself in that desperate fight at the Alma, and my pleasure and satisfaction in the fact that upon the whole it suffered fewer casualties than other regiments." He felt that this showed the mettle of the regiment. Before his letter arrived, Colonel Hood was killed in the trenches near Sevastopol, which showed you what would have happened if Albert had followed his own Grenadier Guards. Yet not long after that, the Member of Parliament from Lambeth complained in the House of Commons that the Prince was collecting £2,200 salary for the colonelcy of a battalion he wasn't leading into battle, while others of similar rank were risking their lives. Another MP, though, a Army colonel, got up and said, if the honorable gentleman would look at the number of battalions commanded by His Royal Highness, he'd find that the increase was a perfectly just one, that his increase in salary was a perfectly just one. The implication was that Albert had a major role in the prosecution of the war. And he went on to say, would it be better to recognize him for what he does than for what he cannot do? His Royal Highness cannot discharge the functions of a colonel. You won't permit him to go to the wars very properly. Of course, it would never do to have the husband of the Queen come home in a cask of rum. I don't know if you're familiar with that situation. The way to preserve a body, if you want to send it a long distance then, back home for burial, was to put it in a cask of rum. And in that way, the alcohol would be a preservative. Might have been a waste of good rum, but that's how it was done, and the audience understood. He said, you won't let him have that happen to him. But Albert had many jobs then in the war. Since there was no way to do anything about the sick and the wounded, Albert arranged for what they then called the Patriotic Fund, which was money raised by private means rather than by Parliament. And it raised £1 million to supply nursing and medical care. This is how Florence Nightingale got there. He asked for regular reports on the state of rations, on forage for the horses, on sanitation, clothing, fuel, quarters, ordnance. And the Secretary of War followed Albert's letters quite carefully. And so government stinginess and inflexibility and absence of compassion were balanced by the fact that Albert intruded into every level of the war. He intruded so much, in fact, that at one point he's the one who worked on strategy to try to outsmart the Russians in the Black Sea. And what he did was devise a surprise attack on the supply base at Kerch, on the eastern tip of the Crimea, where a strait links the Black Sea with the Sea of Azov to the north. And the expedition, commanded by a captain then promoted to admiral, struck there. They landed troops that destroyed installations. They beached and burned 4 warships and captured all the Russian stores of grain that were intended to relieve the siege of Sevastopol. And so, to some major extent, the siege was relieved because Albert was involved in the strategy. He was always involved in new ideas. He proposed, for example, a new siege gun for use in the Crimea, and he designed one. It was more useful, perhaps, than the shako hat, and he envisioned what he called floating cupolas, partly submerged floating gun turrets for bombarding shore fortifications, and he hoped to have one ready for use against the Russians. He was always designing something. But before the cupola could be tried in practice, it was gutted by fire just before the night it was to be launched. It was a £45,000 investment, only partially covered by insurance. And rumor had it, of course they were always anti-Albert, that he had arranged that because he was sure it was going to fail. So he could never do anything right, so it seemed. They didn't have enough men to finish the war, so he arranged for a foreign legion to help them, for the Sardinians, later to become Italy, for the Sardinians to come, for these were Piedmontese troops that Victor Emmanuel, the king, offered. And Albert offered to pay for the troops, to pay their salaries, and to send ships to get them. And later, it would be useful because it was possible to send British troops to the mutiny, to end the mutiny in India, because there were other troops that could take care of the problems of occupation in the Crimea until the war was settled. Anyway, Albert finally won that battle too. The day after Christmas, the Times added, "It was disgraceful that England, so wealthy, so mechanical, and with such an infinity of resources, should waste its soldiers wholesale out of a lack of military science, not to say a lack of common sense." And so the war ended not the way Albert wanted, because Russia got more out of it than it should. And Albert was out of the peace treaty negotiations. He was only involved in the military. He had declined to replace Wellington, but informally he was involved in the winding down of the war. Despite years of jokes at his expense about his exalted military rank, he was, through attrition, the only field marshal in the army. And since that seemed to Victoria and Albert impolitic, at the end of the war they promoted 3 active generals and made them field marshals along with Albert. There may be more to say, but I think I've about run out of time, and you may have some questions to ask me, so I think I'll stop right there. Thank you. I didn't mention the charge of the Light Brigade, though I'm wearing a cardigan, and Lord Cardigan was involved in it. I wore it specially for that purpose, and then I forgot to mention him. It was another one of the incompetent acts in the war. The charge of the Light Brigade should never have happened. It was a result of failed communications or mixed communications. Lord Raglan, Lord Cardigan, and others got titles and got promoted as a result of their incompetence because they survived and they were kept on. Even Lord Harding, who was in charge of the army as commander-in-chief, was given new honors at the end of the war. He died of a heart attack at just about this time, so he had to be replaced. And who did Victoria want to replace him with? Her cousin George, the Duke of Cambridge, because after all, you want to reward the upper aristocracy. And it took Albert quite a time to delay that, and somebody else came in for a while. But after some years passed, Albert couldn't hold that back anymore, and Victoria's favorite cousin came in. He was no good, but he served as commander-in-chief for 50 years, nearly. 50 years. Yes?
Now, Prince Albert was a prince of Saxe-Coburg, you said. And I'm just wondering, because Catherine II, Empress of Russia, was a princess of Saxe-Anhalt, and her son married into the house of Saxe-Coburg. So actually, the Tsar and the Tsar of Russia, Alexander or Nicholas, they were cousins of his.
He did have cousins, yes, who were part of the Tsar's family. And in fact, one of Albert's aunts, who later moved to Switzerland when she divorced her husband, was married to the Russian Grand Duke and had to change her name when she married the Grand Duke to some Russian name. It didn't work out. He was apparently a terrible man, and she left him and went to live in Switzerland. But Albert always knew her as his Russian aunt. So there were, yes, the intermarriages were tremendous, and later on Victoria herself became known as the grandmother of Europe because so many of her children, including one of her daughters, married into the Tsar's family. Her daughter's daughter, I'm sorry, it's a granddaughter, became the last Tsarina of Russia. And so they were everywhere. One became the Queen of Spain, the one granddaughter, the Queen of Spain. They were everywhere. And naturally, those who were affiliated with the Russian family caused Albert a lot of grief, as I mentioned, and that rumor about the Tower of London.
Did Britain have service academies?
Britain had service academies, but they came about largely through Prince Albert. There was a service academy at Sandhurst, which wasn't much good, and Albert upgraded it. Also, Albert established the training grounds at Aldershot. Aldershot is now very famous as a place where the British Army holds maneuvers. And they've been holding maneuvers there for many years, but Albert established Aldershot. The reason he did is that when he was a teenager, he was taken under the wing of King Leopold, his uncle, King Leopold of Belgium. Again, the family spread all over the place. And King Leopold took him to maneuvers that he had established at a training ground in Belgium. Albert was very impressed as a teenager by this. And when he came to England and discovered they didn't have anything of this sort in England, so much a bigger country and a country with more duties and responsibilities, that he set up Aldershot. And regularly he and Victoria went to Aldershot to view maneuvers there. They would always go inspecting things. I didn't bring one cartoon of Aldershot, but there is one of the Queen and Prince doing that. This is one of the Queen and Prince inspecting the Navy with their children. Maybe you can see the brood of children who are with them. This was again to make fun of the large family. But Albert was constantly checking on efficiency and continued to do that. And so Sandhurst was improved by Albert and Aldershot actually devised by Albert. Yes?
The American connection, could you elaborate a little bit about that?
I
We're
hadn't.
pretty close to the American Civil War now. So.
Yeah, Albert's involvement with the mutiny in India and with the Crimean War was just a few years before the American Civil War began. When the American Civil War began, England had had a long history of problems with the United States since the War of 1812. They were border problems, the border with Maine, the border in the Northwest between Washington State and Canada, and there were quite often threats of real war and action across the border, even along Lake Erie. So that there were still feelings of hostility toward the United States. Then the Civil War began in 1861, and the Americans tried, the North, tried to keep the Southerners from going to send ambassadors to England to buy munitions and to negotiate for rights and recognition. And at one point, the Americans intercepted a ship called the Trent, a British mail ship. I spoke about this to a group here a couple of months back, about the Trent. We intercepted the Trent because we said that it was carrying contraband. It was carrying Confederate dispatches, which in effect were contraband. We took Mason and Slidell, the two men who were from the Confederacy, and their two secretaries off the boat, and sent them to prison in Boston Harbor. The British almost went to war with us about this because they said it was a violation of the rules of the sea, and we insulted their flag. And it took Albert personally a great effort to do something about defusing that crisis. The Prime Minister, Palmerston, actually wanted war with England, wanted war rather with the United States, because he wanted sources of cotton to be restored, and he wanted America to be reduced as a commercial rival. So he wanted war. But Albert managed, as the last act in his life, to settle this by writing a watered-down ultimatum to the United States that Lincoln and Seward could actually respond to favorably. As I said, it was the last act of his life. He wrote the memorandum when he said his fingers could hardly hold the pen. He was dying, so they thought, of typhoid fever. He was actually dying of cancer, which he had had for a long time, but had hidden from people. And the Civil War never included the British because of Albert's involvement at the end of his life. He died when he was only 42. But it was the last war involvement that Field Marshal Prince Albert, as I've called him, did have. Are there? Yes?
I'm just curious, well, when the tobacco put Prince Albert on the can, was that because of a regal symbol, or was that because of some type of noble British association? Because I know that as kids we always called to find out whether we could get Prince Albert out of the can. But I was just curious how he got on the can.
Yeah. This was a very common joke for many years. It tells your age, though, that you, that you know about Prince Albert in the can. Somebody gave me an empty Prince Albert can, by the way, so I have that in my collection. The irony of that is that Albert would never have used the likes of it. He did not smoke. He did not smoke because Victoria didn't like it. I mean, it would have been very common for gentlemen of his age and rank to smoke cigars, in particular, not pipes. But Victoria disliked the tobacco smell intensely, and she would have nothing to do with it. She insisted that her rooms be smoke-free long before we had such things. And Albert had one room in Osborne Castle, one of their homes, which had an A over the doorway rather than a V for Victoria. And it wasn't his smoking room, but it was a billiard room in which he could take gentlemen who wanted to smoke. And that gives you an idea that Albert would have had contempt for Prince Albert. But it was a time when royalty were used without their permission for advertising various products. There is a very famous ad later in Victoria's life in which her picture is shown in an ad for Pears soap. I don't know if any of you even recall. No one here may be old enough to remember Pears soap, though raise your hand if you are. But in any case, Pears soap was advertised with Queen Victoria's portrait. And although she hated it, there was nothing she could do about it. Now apparently there's some problem with Bill Clinton's picture being used to advertise something or other. And the White House is protesting. I don't know what will happen with that.